Welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, September 23rd, 2020, and today I'm going to be taking a look at a 2020 electoral map if minority voters increase their turnout comparatively to 2016 by 5%. So what this means is that we're going to be looking at the voting groups in this country. We're going to be combining black voters, Latinx voters, Asian voters, all the other voters that aren't white voters combined into one demographic group that we're going to be moving the turnout number from 51% up to 56%. So in 2016, the Democratic Party won over minority groups as a whole by 59%, 79% to 21%. I'm assuming that this is not accounting for third-party voters this time around, which makes sense. So a D plus 59% margin is very good for the Democratic Party. As you can see, in terms of every demographic group, the Democratic Party won them over by a pretty solid margin. Now, in terms of white voters, Trump won them by 15%. So right now, what we're seeing nationwide is that Biden is doing better amongst white voters than Hillary Clinton. In fact, in some key battleground states, he's tied. When he's tied and the Democrats lead on average by 59, 58, 59% in terms of minority voters, you can see why it's easy for Biden to win the election if that is the case. But right now, off the 2016 margin, Republicans won white voters by 15%. But as we look at the minority groups, they only turned out in with 51% of expected voters, which means if we're increasing it by 5%, it'll be a pretty, not too strong majority, but a majority that isn't necessarily statistically, could be a statistical error. I mean, 51% turnout in 2016 isn't exactly the best numbers that the Democratic Party has seen in the past. Take a look at black voters, 60% turnout, which was down from 66% turnout in 2012. If it was 66% turnout, you'll see that the election doesn't fundamentally change too much, except for the fact that Michigan and Pennsylvania move to the left, but Wisconsin and Trump still end up going red, and Trump still ends up winning the election. But we'll get rid of those states. We'll put it back down to 61% and revert back to what we see as the 306-232 map that we are all used to. Now let's adjust turnout amongst Black, Latinx, and Asian voters across this country and others, so Pacific Islanders. There's my Slack notification. My bad about that. But let's increase it. Let's see what happens when we change it by 1%. Well, nothing too much. States sort of get a little bit less red. Increasing it by 2%, Michigan moves over. So Michigan was the closest state in the 2016 presidential election. So it makes sense that only a 2% increase can flip its 16 electoral votes. It goes from Trump over to Biden. But again, looking around the country, typical swing states, not much fundamentally changes. Let's add an additional percent to the Democratic Party. Again, not too much changing. They started at 51. Now they're at 54. So they're roughly halfway there. We can add an additional number in terms of turnout. And you can see with that 1%, Pennsylvania and Florida move to the left. Why? Well, when we're talking about the large composition of for the Democratic Party's vote share of black voters in Pennsylvania and Latinx voters in Florida, well, altogether, you could see why with Trump only winning Pennsylvania by less than a percentage and Florida by only a percentage, if the minority groups turned out at a larger rate, it is very possible that Florida and Pennsylvania and Michigan all move over into the Biden column. And this final 1% doesn't actually change anything. Wisconsin seems to be the state that's holding out the most out of all of this. So 56% turnout ends up being a 297-241 map. And I honestly think that this is pretty substantial. The 297 map to 241 is something that we really haven't seen in a while. So let's go ahead and click over at this state. We're going to refresh the screen just because it ended up glitching out. But again, let's talk about that scenario. So the states that flipped, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida, they total up to 65 electoral votes. Well, that's not the right article. They total up to 65 electoral votes. And that's obviously enough to put Joe Biden over the top. But it does, ask the question, well, what happens if Trump wins over more minority voters? I mean, yes, Biden is winning them by a pretty solid margin amongst every demographic group. But at the same time, he's marginally losing support in some of these battleground states. So if the Democrats lost maybe 1% of voters amongst, these minority voters, Trump wins the election. 1%, right? 2%. Pennsylvania goes red. Okay. Talk about 3, 4, 5%. Michigan's back to normal. So, looking at this D plus 59 margin, I think this is where the Biden campaign, if they were retaining Clinton's support amongst white voters, then, you would say that the Biden campaign might be in some trouble. But at the same time, amongst white voters, let's go ahead and revert back to our 306 map. Biden is expected to do very well amongst white voters. We're talking single digits. And if it just narrows down to just single digits, well, you see the country move in a way that we haven't seen since the Obama era. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, all go blue, just if Biden gets it down to single digits. So you can see why the Democratic Party isn't too stressed out that they have lost not too large of the amount of minority voters, but at the same time, still something to note. But at the same time, the margin that's being made up for by the Biden campaign in terms of white voters is something that the Biden campaign is relying on to win the election. Because this, combined with increased minority turnout, well, you can guess it. The Democratic Party wins the election pretty solidly. I mean, if this was the map, it doesn't let you do this on the Washington Post graphic that I'm using. By the way, it is the Washington Post. You can check that out on their website. But if we were to combine it, I'm sure we would see, Texas narrow up. We would see Georgia possibly flip. So it is possible that in this map, the Democratic Party does very well, depending on the white turnout, white vote share for Biden. If it is down to single digits, very good for Biden, which means he could technically afford to lose minority support, because a single state doesn't flip up until a point where you get to around the Democrats only winning the minority vote by 51%. If we go back to where it was in 2016, that's an 8-point decrease. So 8 points it would take for Trump to increase in order to win a Clinton state from 2016. But Biden's absolutely going to be making it up through the white voter margin from, comparing it to 2016. So 5% increased turnout. What does that do? Puts the Democrats at 297, 241. I think this is the map they really need to look at, because what we see with the Black Lives Matter movement and what we see with the Supreme Court and, civil liberties in general, a lot of voters are going to be outraged. They're going to want to vote for the Democratic Party as they did in 2018. Now, whether or not the Democratic Party can tap into that and whether they can work with Pennsylvania on trying to worry about naked ballots and worry about voter registration, the Florida Democratic Party has done abysmally over the past couple of months in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. 3 crucial states, but it seems as if, Trump will likely be leading in these battleground states on election night. These mail-in voters really need to make sure what they're doing is right, because on election day, it is very likely that Republicans vote in person and Democrats vote absentee. But if you don't know how to vote absentee, if you don't know how to submit your vote by mail, it's possible that you mess it up and your vote isn't counted. Whereas someone who goes in person, you can't really mess up voting in person, right? So looking at some of these states, it is crucial that the Biden campaign does an education effort in order to inform voters as to how they can vote. On top of that, I would also say that the the Democratic Party really just needs to up their efforts in terms of dropping off your ballots in person, not sending it through the mail if it's going to end up being late, or if there's any discussion of voter suppression or possibly even election fraud. This election, we're going to see the largest percent vote by mail in U.S. history. Largest percent. And it was actually pretty high in 2016. 25% of voters submitted their vote absentee/vote by mail. Same exact thing. So in 2016, 1 in 4 voters voted by mail. But what we're seeing now is over 61 million ballots requested, which means roughly half of the 2016 votes are going to be at least counted by mail. So looking at these numbers, I will say that if the number increased turnout does get a tad bit higher, it's enough to move Wisconsin over, but it's not exactly within striking distance. You'd have to add an additional 3% in terms of turnout, and then it narrowly goes to Biden. As we increase it, Georgia then goes, North Carolina then goes, but then you see Arizona is heavily reliant on the white vote. Yes, it has a very large Latinx population, but at the same time, white voters are going to be driving what the Democratic Party needs to win. We're talking about suburban voters around the, not Atlanta suburbs, around the Phoenix suburbs, the same ones that landed Kyrsten Sinema in the Senate just 2 years ago, that landed 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans in the House of Representatives from Arizona in 2018. So again, the Democratic Party is going to be relying on their the people that elected them just 2 years ago. But with an increased turnout number by 5%, you see that the election drastically changes. I mean, the Republicans end up going from winning the 2016 election with those numbers, just a 5% increase, which arguably is not too high. It may seem like a lot, but then again, you look at 2016 versus 2012, we saw a 7-point drop amongst black voters in general. Overall, minority turnout was down. So when you think about that and you think about how Donald Trump was able to win the election, well, if he narrowly won in some of these battleground states like Michigan, like Pennsylvania, like Florida, and you realize that minority turnout was down 6-7%, and then it's back increased up by 5%, you're going to start to realize that, okay, Obama won these states by high single digits. Trump won it by less than a percentage point. Any increase for the Democrats is enough to land them over the top in Michigan, enough to land them over the top in Pennsylvania and Florida. Because get this, it denies Trump from 270. Even if he retains every other swing state from 2016, including Wisconsin, Arizona, Texas, Iowa, Ohio, North Carolina, Georgia, he still loses the election. And that's where the Democratic Party is pretty confident in their efforts that they will win the election because they have that advantage, because they're able to, hold on to states that they carried just 4 years ago. On top of that, they have a very strong advantage in some of these other battleground states. And all they need is to return back to similar Obama numbers. It doesn't need to be Obama turnout, but it looks like it is on track to be Obama turnout. So with the movement of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida, with this increased plus 5% turnout, the Democratic Party wins the election. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord link for you to go ahead and join. Let's try to get to 700 members before the election. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2020 election videos. Make sure to check out the merchandise in the description down below, and please consider joining as a member on this channel, and I will see you all tomorrow.